So Neal calls this the road less traveled, a sermon in absentia by Reverend Dr. Neal Jones. And now he's got to write another emergency sermon. So it may come as a surprise to some of you to know that Paul, not Jesus, is the real founder of Christianity. It was Paul who turned the religion of Jesus into a religion about Jesus. Instead of continuing the teachings of Jesus, Paul made up beliefs about Jesus, namely that he was the Son of God, that his death saved people from their sins, and that he came back to life after being put to death. Paul insisted that people had to believe these things in order to be a Christian. And Paul's beliefs carried a lot of weight in the early development of Christianity because he was a frenetic missionary in the Roman world, and his letters to many of the early churches formed half of the New Testament. Ironically, Paul never met Jesus, except in some kind of vision he had of Jesus. These beliefs of Paul came to define Orthodox Christianity. My father was an Orthodox Catholic archbishop. I have some familiarity with this. Orthodoxy literally means right belief, in the same way that orthodontic means right teeth, and orthopedic means right bones, and orthography means right spelling. Here's the way it works. Some group of people have the arrogance to proclaim that some set of beliefs are the right beliefs. And oddly, they always happen to coincide with their beliefs. These beliefs are declared as the ultimate and final truth. This is how it is, this is how it ever will be, end of discussion. But there are always others who want to continue the discussion, and they are labeled heretics. Heresy is an interesting word. It comes from a Greek word meaning choice. Heretics want to exercise choice about what they believe, instead of just swallowing hook, line, and sinker what they are told to believe. They want to seek for themselves more light where others tell them not to look. They take the road less traveled. One of the ironies of Christian history is that the early Christians were declared heretics by the Roman pagans because they didn't believe in the pagan gods. In fact, one of the reasons Jesus was executed, according to the New Testament, is that he was regarded as a heretic by Orthodox Jews. This, too, seems to be a pattern of orthodoxy. Once you believe, you have the right to declare your beliefs as the only right beliefs. Then it is just a small step to believing that you have the right to declare all other beliefs wrong. Then it's another step to believing it is your right to eliminate wrong beliefs, which leads to believing it is your right to eliminate people who hold the wrong beliefs. Christians didn't start out waterboarding and burning people at the stake. I don't know if you knew that waterboarding was an invention of the Spanish Inquisition. Christians started out with a creed-defining orthodoxy, which eventually led to waterboarding and burning heretics at the stake. The church's first major creed was the Nicene Creed, which made belief in the Trinity an orthodox belief and Unitarians heretics. I think I could still recite the Nicene Creed. Eventually, the familiar pattern kicked in. A young Spanish doctor who discovered the circulation of blood, Michael Servetus, wrote a treatise entitled On the Errors of the Trinity. The title alone, he had to have known, would have gotten him in trouble. And he was put on the hit list of the Spanish Inquisition. For 2 decades, he managed to elude them, but then made the fatal error of seeking refuge in Geneva, where he assumed another heretic of the Catholic Church, John Calvin, would provide safe haven. This was a case where the proverb, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," did not prove to be true. Calvin had Servetus burned at the stake in 1553. Unitarians in Poland were called Socinians because they followed the anti-Trinitarian teachings of the humanist biblical scholar Fautus Socinus. I'm not even sure how that gets pronounced, but it does sound kind of like a Harry Potter character. Fautus Socinus. One of them, an elderly woman named Catherine Weigel, took the road less traveled and publicly disavowed the Trinity. She was arrested and locked up by the Bishop of Krakow, but she refused to recant for the next 10 years. And eventually, the bishop's patience ran out, and he had her burned at the stake when she was 80 years old. Otherwise, the Socinians thrived in tolerant Poland, building churches and schools until the Jesuits took control of the government and made Poland intolerant by decreeing that those who would not profess belief in the Trinity could not own land or have any other civil rights. Socinian churches and monuments were obliterated, and many fled to Transylvania. In Transylvania, Francis David, who is considered by many historians to be the father of Unitarianism, took the road less traveled. He grew up Catholic, became Lutheran, then Calvinist, and then finally a Unitarian. Like many Unitarians, he had a meandering spiritual journey. The king of Transylvania, John Sigismund, was an intellectual who hosted theological debates at the royal court. The talented David took on the Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Calvinists and bested them every time, probably because he had been one of them at some point in his life and he knew the errors of their ways. Sounds like he was an Orthodox Unitarian. Each of his opponents declared that if they were victorious, they would condemn David to death as a heretic. David replied, "If I win, I shall defend to the death your right to be wrong." Because David was so convincing, King Sigismund chose Unitarianism as his religion, but unlike almost every other monarch in history, he did not make his personal religion the state religion. Instead, thanks to David's influence, he issued the Edict of Torda, which instituted religious tolerance in Transylvania, even of Jews and Muslims. In the words of David, we need not think alike to love alike. Tolerance lasted only a short while, however, as the young king died from a hunting accident a few years later. And Catholics said his premature death was God's punishment for his heresy. There was probably a hurricane during that time, too. When the Jesuits came to power after Sigismund's death, they banished Unitarians and locked up Francis David, who died in prison in 1579. Unitarianism from Poland and Transylvania eventually found its way to England, where Joseph Priestley took the road less traveled. Priestley was an English Thomas Jefferson, a true Renaissance man, with interests and accomplishments in theology, philosophy, literature, politics, and chemistry. Some of you may remember from chemistry class that Priestley is the one who discovered oxygen. I majored in science and no one ever taught me that. He was also a Unitarian minister, and his book, A History of the Corruptions of Christianity, again, these titles, they're dangerous, caused quite a stir with its charge that Christianity had gone astray by abandoning its Unitarian view of God and its humanistic view of Jesus. But it was Priestley's politics as much as his theology that really got him in trouble. After supporting the American Revolution, he then supported the French Revolution, neither of which was a particularly popular position in England. On Bastille Day, an unruly mob, I don't know that there's ever been a ruly mob, burned Priestley's church, his home, and his laboratory. Priestley interpreted these events as a sign that he was no longer welcome in England. So he and his wife set sail for America, where they joined his friends George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Rush, and Thomas Jefferson. Priestley started the first Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, which, as you all know, still stands today. It's hard to believe that once upon a time, people were imprisoned, tortured, and killed, and that wars were fought and entire populations slaughtered over a particular religious belief, especially over belief in one God instead of three gods in one. But that's what happens when church and state are not separate. When religion has the power of government at its disposal, heresy is not merely an errant way of thinking, it becomes a punishable crime. And as Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong points out, heresy hunters are not only ruthless, they are ignorant and idolatrous as well. They are ignorant because they think they know what ultimately cannot be known, namely the nature of God. They are idolatrous because they have identified God with a definition of God. They have bound God inside human words, concepts, and creeds. They have created God and think that their creation is God. That's the meaning of idolatry. Our Unitarian ancestors here in America continued the heretical heritage, say that 10 times fast, of our European ancestors. William Ellery Channing distinguished us from Trinitarian Congregationalists in an ordination sermon in 1819 entitled simply Unitarian Christianity. Taking some 90 minutes to deliver, you think you have it bad here? It became one of the most famous sermons in American history. Its printed version became the most popular publication in the country up to that time, save only Thomas Paine's Common Sense. What you may not know about Channing is that the Unitarian church he had served for 40 years tried to require its members to conform to a statement of Unitarian beliefs, and he resigned in protest. To the end of his life, Channing continued to take the road less traveled. By the 1830s, a new generation of Unitarians called the Transcendentalists began challenging Unitarian orthodoxy. In his address to the graduating class at Harvard Divinity School, Ralph Waldo Emerson scandalized his former teachers by saying that Unitarians had become corpse cold in their rationality, custodians of a second-hand faith. Rather than reading about other people's faith in the Bible, Emerson dared Unitarians to experience the divine directly in the beauty of nature around them and the moral law within them. It would be another 40 years before Emerson would be invited back to Harvard. We Unitarians today like to claim Emerson as one of our stars, yet the Orthodox Unitarians of his day considered him a heretic. The most radical of the Transcendentalists was Theodore Parker, who delivered an infamous ordination sermon in 1841 entitled The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity. These guys at least chose like safe titles. In which he said that creeds, doctrines, and confessions of faith were mere transient expressions of faith. He also said that the Bible was a transient expression of faith. He said that Jesus was a transient expression of faith. If Jesus of Nazareth had never lived, said Parker, still Christianity would stand firm. What is permanent about Christianity and other religions, according to Parker? Their ethical teachings. His Unitarian colleagues were appalled. They blacklisted him, not inviting him to speak from their pulpits. The Boston Association of Ministers asked him to resign, but he refused, so they simply left his name off the published roster of members. When Parker insisted on taking his turn in preaching the Great Thursday Lecture, they simply discontinued that series. We Unitarians today like to claim Parker as one of our stars, yet again, the Orthodox Unitarians of his day considered him a heretic as well. By the turn of the century, another generation of Unitarian heretics took the road less traveled called humanism. In the Humanist Manifesto of 1933, they declared that religion itself had lost its significance and was powerless to solve the problem of human living in the 20th century. They advocated science against supernaturalism, democracy against tyranny, reason against superstition, and experience against revelation. Today, humanism is the dominant frame of reference within this religion called Unitarian Universalism. Here's another pattern in the Orthodox heresy dynamic. Yesterday's heresy becomes today's orthodoxy. Jesus was declared a heretic by the Jews. Martin Luther and John Calvin were declared heretics by the Catholics. Unitarians and Universalists were declared heretics by the Protestants. Darwin and Freud were declared heretics by other scientists. Thomas Jefferson, Susan B. Anthony, and Martin Luther King were declared heretics by the political establishment. The pattern seems to be for history to make monuments to heretics after they have died, and for their followers to make their radical message a tame creed. They orthodox the heresy. I can't imagine Luther being a Lutheran or Freud being a Freudian, and I'm absolutely certain that Jesus would not be a Christian. He would be both baffled and infuriated by the things done in his name, the cruel wars and senseless acts of violence against those who disagree, the petty prejudices and hostility toward those who are different, the ostentatious wealth at the expense of those who are vulnerable, the prosperity gospel, and the callousness of those with so much and their neglect of those with so little in his name. He would think that he had arrived in bizarro world, in which everything is turned upside down, where the first stay on top and the last are ground down even further, where the golden rule becomes twisted into Do others before they do you, and do them good. Being heretics is both a blessing and a curse. Our willingness to take the road less traveled brings wider horizons, fresh insight, and new life. It also brings some wackiness. What do UU congregations have in common with bowls of granola? Both contain fruits, nuts, and flakes. If you're like me, and I know Neal wrote this, but if you're like me too, you wouldn't have it any other way. I suspect that Unitarian Universalism will always be a minority religion, because if we ever get too popular and mainstream, we will have to become, God forbid, Orthodox. A fate worse than death. Amen.